My name is Sienna Jones, and at 59 years old, I thought I knew what rock bottom looked like. I was wrong. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in my cramped studio apartment in Portland. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar tune, rain pelted against the single window, and I sat at my kitchen table, which was also my desk, dining room, and office, preparing for another day at Morrison & Associates, where I'd worked as a senior accountant for 12 years. 12 years of arriving early, staying late, and covering for colleagues half my age who treated spreadsheets like abstract art. 12 years of being the reliable one, the one who never called in sick, never missed a deadline, never caused drama. The model employee, they called me. Right up until the moment they didn't. Sienna, we need to talk. James Morrison's voice still echoes in my head sometimes, especially in the quiet hours before dawn. He couldn't even look me in the eye as he delivered the news. Budget cuts, he said. Restructuring. Nothing personal. The usual corporate poetry that translates to, "You're too old, too expensive, and we found someone younger who'll work for half your salary." 26 years in accounting, and I was out on the street with a cardboard box and 2 weeks severance pay. At 59. In an economy that treats women my age like expired milk. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent decades managing other people's money, making sure every penny was accounted for, every investment properly allocated, but I'd never been great at managing my own financial future. Too busy supporting everyone else, I suppose. Like my son Freddie, 32 years old, and perpetually between opportunities. For the past 3 years, I'd been supplementing his rent, his car payments, his credit card minimums. Not because he asked, Freddie was too proud for that, but because I could see the stress eating away at him. His wife Jennifer had expensive tastes and a flexible relationship with employment. Their 2 kids needed things: school supplies, soccer cleats, birthday parties, the kinds of expenses that add up quietly until they're crushing you. Then there was my daughter Sharon, 29 and living in Seattle with her girlfriend Melissa. Sharon worked at a nonprofit, which meant she worked twice as hard for half the money she deserved. Every few months there'd be a crisis: car repair, medical bill, security deposit for a new apartment because the old landlord was problematic. I helped because that's what mothers do. That's what I thought mothers did. The day after I got fired, I called them both. Not to ask for help, not yet, but to let them know what had happened. I expected sympathy, maybe some encouragement. What I got was silence that stretched so long I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Mom," Freddie finally said, his voice carrying that particular tone I'd learned to dread. The one that meant he was about to explain why my problems were actually my fault. "You should have seen this coming. Companies don't keep older employees anymore. You should have been preparing for this." Preparing. As if I hadn't been preparing by giving him $3,000 just last month to keep his family's health insurance active. Sharon was gentler, but no less devastating. "That's really tough, Mom. Have you looked into those age discrimination lawyers? I saw something on social media about that." Then, after another pause, "I wish I could help financially, but you know how tight things are for us right now." Right. Tight. Like the weekend trip to Napa Valley she'd posted on Instagram 2 weeks earlier. For the next month, I threw myself into job hunting with the desperation of a drowning woman. Applications, interviews, networking events where I smiled until my face hurt and pretended that 26 years of experience was exactly what every employer was looking for. The rejections came in various flavors, some polite, some blunt, most just silence. The few interviews I managed to land had a similar rhythm: enthusiasm about my qualifications, followed by concerned looks when they calculated my age, then promises to be in touch soon. Meanwhile, my savings account hemorrhaged money: rent, utilities, food, gas, phone bill. The severance pay lasted exactly 2 weeks, as advertised. By the end of the second month, I was choosing between groceries and medication. By the third month, I was behind on rent and facing eviction. That's when I made the calls I'd been dreading. "Freddie, I need to ask you something difficult." I explained the situation as carefully as I could, emphasizing that it would be temporary, just until I found something stable. I had leads, I told him. Promising interviews. I just needed a little help to bridge the gap. The silence this time was different. Colder. Mom, I can't take on another financial obligation right now. Jennifer's talking about going back to school and the kids need— I'm not asking you to support me, I interrupted. I'm asking for a loan. I'll pay you back with interest. It's not about the money, he said, though we both knew it was exactly about the money. It's about enabling dependency. You need to figure this out on your own. Maybe this is the push you needed to make some real changes. Real changes. At 59. After losing everything. Sharon's response was wrapped in more therapeutic language. She'd always been good with words. But the message was identical. She couldn't help. Wouldn't help. I needed to take responsibility for my own life. Responsibility. From the daughter whose student loans I'd co-signed, whose first apartment deposit I'd covered, whose car I'd helped her buy when she graduated college. 3 days before my eviction date, I called Freddie one more time. Not to ask for money, I'd learned that lesson, but to ask if I could stay with them for a few weeks. Just until I got back on my feet. I could help with the kids, I offered. Cook, clean, babysit. Earn my keep. This time, the silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Mom, he said finally, I think it would be better if you figured out other arrangements. Other arrangements. As if I had family scattered across the country just waiting for my call. As if 59-year-old unemployed women had endless options for shelter and support. That night, I sat on my couch, soon to be my former couch, and stared at the eviction notice taped to my door. The paper was white and official and final. 72 hours to vacate the premises. I thought about the years I'd spent building what I thought was a safety net, only to discover it was made of tissue paper. I thought about the Christmas mornings when money was tight, but I made sure my children had everything they wanted under the tree. I thought about the school plays and soccer games and graduation ceremonies where I cheered the loudest because I was so proud of the people they were becoming. Most of all, I thought about the phone calls that were coming. The ones where my children would express concern about my situation, offer emotional support and helpful suggestions, maybe even feel a little guilty about their inability to help, but not guilty enough to actually help. I was wrong about those calls too. They never came. What came instead was something I didn't expect, something that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. It was Freddie's voice on my voicemail, 3 days after the eviction, 3 days after I'd been sleeping in my car in a Walmart parking lot. Mom, we need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I have an idea that might help both of us. For just a moment, listening to those words, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. I should have known better. The Dairy Queen, where Freddie suggested we meet, sat on the edge of Gresham, one of those franchise islands surrounded by a sea of cracked asphalt and dying strip malls. I arrived 20 minutes early because I had nowhere else to be, nursing a small coffee I couldn't really afford while watching morning commuters rush past the windows toward lives that still had structure and purpose. When Freddie walked in, I barely recognized him. Not because he looked different. He was still the same lanky frame. The same nervous energy that made him tap his fingers against whatever surface was nearest, but because of the way he looked at me, like I was a problem he needed to solve rather than the woman who'd spent 18 years making sure he never went to bed hungry. You look tired, Mom, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. No hug, no real greeting, just an observation delivered with the clinical detachment of a social worker. I've been sleeping in my car for 3 days, I replied. Tired doesn't begin to cover it. He winced, but it was the kind of wince you make when someone mentions an uncomfortable truth, not when someone you love is suffering. Yeah, about that. I've been thinking about your situation, and I might have a solution. My situation. As if my homelessness was a math problem he could solve with the right formula. I'm listening, I said, though something in his tone made my coffee taste bitter. Freddie leaned forward, adopting what I recognized as his business voice, the one he used when he was trying to sound important during work calls I'd overheard during my visits to his house. You know Jennifer's been wanting to expand her photography business, right? Well, we've been looking at property up in the Cascade foothills. There's this old cabin, really rustic, kind of off-grid, that's been in foreclosure for months. He pulled out his phone and showed me pictures. The cabin looked like something from a horror movie. Weathered wood siding, broken windows, a porch that sagged like a broken promise. But it was surrounded by towering Douglas firs and sat beside a creek that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. "It needs work," Freddie continued, "but the bones are good. And here's the thing. We could buy it cash with the money from Jennifer's inheritance, fix it up, and you could live there. Rent-free." For a moment, I felt that dangerous flutter of hope again. A place to live. Rent-free. It sounded like salvation. "What's the catch?" I asked, because 32 years of motherhood had taught me to recognize the pause before the other shoe drops. "No catch, exactly. It's just—" He looked out the window, avoiding my eyes. "It's pretty isolated. About 40 minutes from the nearest town. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors for miles. You'd need to be pretty self-sufficient." Self-sufficient. Like the woman who'd just lost her job, her home, and apparently her children's respect. "Freddie, I don't know anything about living off-grid. I've never even been camping." "You'd figure it out," he said with the confidence of someone who'd never had to figure out anything harder than which restaurant to order from. "There's a generator for power, a well for water. People lived like this for thousands of years before we got all soft and dependent on technology." Soft and dependent. The words hit like a slap. "What about finding work?" I asked. "How am I supposed to look for jobs from the middle of nowhere?" His expression shifted then, becoming something I'd never seen before on my son's face. Cold. Calculating. Almost cruel. "Mom, maybe it's time to accept that the traditional job market isn't going to work for you anymore. You're 59. You've been unemployed for months. Companies aren't exactly lining up to hire. People in your situation. People in my situation. Not women, not experienced professionals. Not human beings who deserved dignity and respect. People in my situation. So what are you suggesting? That I just give up and become a hermit? I'm suggesting that you take some time to figure out what's next without the pressure of rent and bills breathing down your neck. Think of it as a sabbatical, a chance to reset. Reset. Like I was a malfunctioning appliance. I stared at the pictures on his phone, trying to imagine myself in that isolated cabin, chopping wood and hauling water and slowly going insane from loneliness. It wasn't a solution. It was exile. But what choice did I have? The Walmart parking lot was getting colder every night, and my car was developing an alarming rattle that I couldn't afford to fix. Winter was coming, and Portland winters could kill. "How long are we talking about?" I asked. "However long you need," Freddie said. But something in his eyes suggested he was hoping for a very long time. "The property's going to be in Jennifer's name for tax purposes, but you'd have complete autonomy. Do whatever you want with the place. Complete autonomy. In a cabin 40 minutes from civilization, with no way to communicate with the outside world." It sounded less like freedom and more like a prison sentence. But it was shelter. And beggars, as they say, can't be choosers. "I'll need help getting there," I said. "And I'll need some supplies. Food, clothes, basic necessities." "Of course," Freddie said. And for the first time since he'd walked in, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just closed a deal that heavily favored his interests. "I can drive you up there this weekend. We'll stop at Costco, get you stocked up with everything you need." Everything I need. As if survival could be purchased in bulk. We spent the next hour going over the details. The cabin had been empty for 2 years, so it would need cleaning. The generator was old but functional. There was a wood stove for heat and a propane stove for cooking. The creek provided water, though I'd need to boil it for drinking. It sounded like stepping backward through time, leaving behind every convenience and comfort I'd ever known. "One more thing," Freddie said as we prepared to leave. "Jennifer wanted me to mention that this arrangement works best if it stays between us. She's worried that if Sharon finds out we helped you and she didn't, it might cause family drama." Family drama. As if my homelessness was less important than his wife's social anxieties. "She doesn't want Sharon to know you're helping me?" "She doesn't want Sharon to feel guilty about not helping you," Freddie corrected. "This way, everyone wins. You get a place to live, we get to use the property as a tax write-off, And Sharon doesn't have to feel bad about her choices. Her choices. Not her selfishness or her cruelty. Her choices. I nodded because what else could I do? I was 59, homeless, and running out of options. Pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. "I'll pick you up Saturday morning," Freddie said, standing to leave. "Pack light. The road up there is pretty rough." After he left, I sat in that booth for another hour, watching the world go by through grease-stained windows. Families heading to soccer games, couples sharing breakfast, teenagers laughing over shared earbuds. Life continuing for everyone except me. I thought about the cabin, isolated and forgotten in the woods. I thought about my son's smile when I'd agreed to his plan. I thought about how easily he'd managed to reframe my exile as a favor he was doing for me. Most of all, I thought about the way he'd said goodbye. No hug, no expression of love or concern. Just a brief nod and a promise to pick me up Saturday morning. Like I was cargo, he was moving from one location to another. I should have recognized the signs then. Should have understood that children who could watch their mother become homeless without losing sleep were capable of much worse than neglect. But I was tired, desperate, and clinging to the belief that blood still meant something. That somewhere beneath the calculation and cruelty, my children still loved me. Saturday morning couldn't come fast enough, and that, I would soon learn, was exactly what Freddie was counting on. Avid arrived at the Walmart parking lot where I'd been living at exactly 9 a.m., punctual as always when it served his purposes. His SUV looked freshly washed, gleaming in the October morning sun, a stark contrast to my Honda Civic with its cracked windshield and rust spots that had spread like a skin condition over the past 3 months. "Ready for your new adventure?" he asked, the forced cheerfulness in his voice making my stomach clench. He didn't wait for an answer before popping his trunk and gesturing to my possessions. 3 garbage bags of clothes, a box of books, and a suitcase that had seen better decades. Everything I owned in the world, and it fit in the back of his car with room to spare. The drive to Costco was silent, except for the radio playing soft rock hits from the 80s. Songs I used to sing while making breakfast for my family, back when I had a family that wanted breakfast made for them. Freddie drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and occasionally glanced at me like he was checking to make sure I hadn't disappeared. Inside Costco, he grabbed a cart and handed me a list he'd apparently prepared in advance. Canned goods, rice, pasta, frozen vegetables, toilet paper, batteries, flashlights. The essentials for survival, portioned out with the same care I'd once used to plan his school lunches. "Stay practical," he said when I paused at a display of fresh flowers. "Remember, you won't be making trips to town very often." Won't be making trips to town, not couldn't, wouldn't. As if my isolation was a choice I was making rather than a situation he was orchestrating. At the checkout, I watched the total climb toward $400. Money I didn't have. Freddie paid without comment, but I caught him photographing the receipt with his phone. "For tax purposes," he explained when he noticed me watching. "Everything documented, everything justified." The drive into the Cascade foothills took us farther and farther from civilization, past suburban developments that gave way to farmland, then to dense forest broken only by logging roads and the occasional rural mailbox. The asphalt ended 20 minutes before we reached our destination, replaced by a dirt road that wound through Douglas firs so tall they blocked out most of the sky. "Almost there," Freddie said as we bounced over potholes deep enough to swallow small animals. "Just around this next bend." The cabin materialized out of the forest like something from a fever dream. The photos on Freddie's phone hadn't captured the full extent of its decay. Boards hung loose from the siding, the front steps sagged dangerously, and one of the windows had been boarded up with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bones. But it was the silence that hit me first. Complete, absolute silence. No traffic, no neighbors, no sound of human civilization. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant murmur of the creek Freddie had mentioned. "Home, sweet home," he said, killing the engine. We spent the next 2 hours unloading supplies and getting the generator running. Freddie seemed to know his way around the cabin's systems, which struck me as odd since he'd presented this as a recent discovery. He showed me how to start the generator, how to light the propane stove, how to work the pump that brought water up from the creek. "The cell service really is non-existent out here," he said, holding up his phone to demonstrate the complete lack of bars. "But you probably need a break from all that technology anyway. Might be good for you to disconnect for a while." Disconnect. Like isolation was a lifestyle choice rather than abandonment. As the afternoon wore on, I began to notice things that didn't align with Freddie's story. The cabin wasn't as run down inside as it appeared from the outside. Someone had been maintaining it. The wood stove was clean, the cupboards were organized, and there were signs of recent occupancy. A coffee mug in the sink that hadn't had time to gather dust. A newspaper dated just 2 weeks ago. "Freddie," I said, holding up the newspaper, "I thought you said this place had been empty for years." He glanced at the paper and shrugged. "Must have been left by the real estate agent. They probably use it as a staging area or something." The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others he'd told me over the years. How many times had I accepted his explanations without question because I wanted to believe my son was honest? By 4 o'clock, we'd finished the setup. My meager possessions looked even more pathetic scattered around the cabin's rustic interior. Freddie checked his watch. Expensive, I noted. More expensive than anything I could afford even when I was employed. "I should head back," he said. "Jennifer's making dinner for her parents tonight, and you know how she gets when I'm late." I did know. Jennifer got pouty and passive-aggressive, and Freddie jumped through hoops to keep her happy. The same way I'd once jumped through hoops to keep him happy. "When will I see you again?" I asked, hating the neediness in my voice but unable to suppress it. "Oh, soon. I'll try to get up here in a few weeks, see how you're settling in." A few weeks. In a place with no phone service, no internet, no way to contact the outside world. He was halfway to his SUV when I called after him. "Freddie, what if there's an emergency? What if something happens and I need help?" He paused with his hand on the driver's door handle, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe. Or regret. "You'll be fine, Mom. You're tougher than you think." Then he was gone, his taillights disappearing into the forest like red eyes winking shut. The sound of his engine faded gradually, replaced by that awful silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I stood on the sagging porch, watching the space where his car had been, and felt the weight of my situation settle over me like a burial shroud. This wasn't a temporary solution or a fresh start. This was exile. This was my son removing me from his life as efficiently as he'd removed an inconvenient expense from his budget. The truth hit me with crystalline clarity. Freddie hadn't saved me. He'd disposed of me. I thought about the careful planning that had gone into this moment. The researched property, the prepared shopping list, his familiarity with the cabin's systems. This hadn't been a spontaneous solution born from concern for my welfare. This had been a calculated move to solve the problem of his homeless mother without having to actually help her. And I'd walked right into it, grateful for the privilege of my own abandonment. That first night, I lay on the cabin's ancient mattress and listened to sounds I'd never heard before. Things moving in the forest, branches creaking in the wind, the generator coughing like a dying animal outside. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. But the most terrifying sound was the one I couldn't hear. The sound of my phone not ringing. No concerned calls from Freddie checking on my first night. No worried texts from Sharon asking how I was settling in. Just silence from the children I'd raised to be better than this. I'd spent months telling myself that their coldness was temporary, that underneath their selfishness was still the love we'd shared when they were young. I'd believed that if I could just get back on my feet, prove that I wasn't a burden, things would return to normal. Now, lying in a cabin that felt more like a tomb than a home, I finally understood the truth. There was no going back to normal. Normal had been an illusion, built on my willingness to give everything and ask for nothing in return. My children didn't love me. They'd tolerated me as long as I was useful, and discarded me the moment I became inconvenient. The realization should have broken me. Instead, it did something else entirely. It freed me. The first week in the cabin nearly killed me. Not from exposure or starvation, but from the weight of understanding what my children had done, what they'd planned. what they'd been capable of all along. I found the property documents on the third day, tucked inside a kitchen drawer beneath some old dish towels. The cabin hadn't been in foreclosure. It had been in Jennifer's family for 15 years. Her grandfather's hunting retreat, maintained by a local caretaker service and used sporadically by various relatives. The recent newspaper I'd found belonged to that caretaker, who'd been preparing the place for my arrival. Freddie had orchestrated every detail: the spontaneous solution, the emotional manipulation, the careful isolation from Sharon to prevent any interference. He'd wanted me gone, and he'd found the perfect way to do it while maintaining plausible deniability. If anyone asked, he'd helped his homeless mother. He was the good son. By the second week, I'd stopped expecting rescue. No one was coming to check on me. No one was wondering if I'd survived my first taste of off-grid living. I was exactly where Freddie wanted me, forgotten. But something strange happened as the days passed. The silence that had initially terrified me began to feel like clarity. Without the constant noise of expectations and obligations, without the daily humiliation of job rejection or the anxiety of impending homelessness, my mind cleared like water settling in a glass. I began to think about things I'd buried for years, like the trust fund my mother had established before her death, money I'd never touched because I'd been too proud to live off inherited wealth. It sat in an account I rarely checked, earning modest interest while I struggled to make ends meet from my salary. $50,000. Not a fortune, but enough. I thought about the power of attorney documents I'd signed years ago, giving Sharon access to my financial accounts in case of emergency. Documents that were still valid, still legally binding. Documents that could be used in ways I'd never intended. Most of all, I thought about the storage unit in Beaverton where I'd kept my mother's belongings after her death. Things I'd been too sentimental to sell, too guilty to donate. Including her jewelry, some of which was quite valuable, and her papers, insurance policies, investment records, real estate documents that might be worth examining more closely. On my 15th day in the cabin, I made a decision that would have horrified the woman I'd been just a month earlier. I was going to walk out of these woods, not to beg for help or plead for forgiveness, but to take back what was mine. The hike to the main road took 4 hours through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and shred clothing. But I'd been eating regularly for the first time in months, sleeping without the fear of eviction, and the physical labor of maintaining the cabin had given me a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. When I finally reached the highway, I looked nothing like the defeated woman who'd arrived 2 weeks earlier. My hair was pulled back severely, my clothes were practical rather than flattering, and my face had acquired a hardness I'd never seen before. The woman who flagged down that passing pickup truck was someone new, someone without illusions about the goodness of family or the fairness of the world. The driver, a rancher named Bill who seemed genuinely concerned about finding a lone woman on a remote highway, gave me a ride to the nearest town. I told him I'd been camping and gotten turned around on the trails. He didn't question the story, even when I asked him to drop me at the bus station rather than somewhere more typical for a lost hiker. The Greyhound to Portland took 3 hours. 3 hours to plan what came next. I started with the storage unit, using the key I'd carried in my wallet for 9 years, like a talisman. My mother's belongings were exactly as I'd left them, covered in dust but intact. The jewelry alone was worth more than I'd expected. My mother had been careful with her investments, including the ones she wore, but it was the papers that provided the real revelation. Insurance policies I'd forgotten about, including one that covered her house until it was officially transferred to new ownership. A house that, according to the documentation, had never been officially transferred. The house I'd assumed Freddie had handled through his real estate connections after my mother's death. The house whose sale had supposedly paid for his down payment on his current home. The house that was still legally mine. A few phone calls from the storage unit's office confirmed what the papers suggested. The property at 1847 Oak Street in southeast Portland was still registered in my mother's name, with me listed as sole beneficiary. Freddie had been collecting rent from tenants for 9 years, while letting me believe the house had been sold. 9 years of rental income. Thousands upon thousands of dollars that should have been mine. My next stop was the bank where my mother's trust fund had been quietly accumulating interest. The account I'd never touched because I'd been too proud to live off free money while my children struggled. Except they hadn't been struggling, had they? They'd been living quite comfortably while orchestrating my poverty. The banker, a middle-aged woman who remembered me from the account setup years earlier, was happy to help me access the funds. She didn't question why I suddenly needed cash, didn't comment on my changed appearance, or the way I carried myself like someone who'd learned not to apologize for taking up space. "Will you be making any other changes to the account today?" she asked as she prepared the withdrawal. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I want to revoke the power of attorney I granted to my daughter Sharon Jones. All of it. Effective immediately." The paperwork took 20 minutes. 20 minutes to sever the last legal connection between my financial security and my children's access to it. By evening, I was checked into a modest hotel downtown, showered and wearing new clothes that fit my transformed sense of self. Practical clothes in dark colors that didn't show dirt or weakness. I sat on the bed with my laptop, purchased that afternoon along with a smartphone that actually worked, and began the real work. Finding Freddie and Jennifer's financial information wasn't difficult. People who live beyond their means leave trails, and people who've been stealing from family members are often careless about covering those trails. Public records, social media posts, mortgage documents, business registrations for Jennifer's photography venture, all available to someone with time and motivation. What I found made my exile in the woods look like a minor inconvenience. They were leveraged to the breaking point. The house I'd believed they owned outright was mortgaged for nearly its full value. Jennifer's photography business existed mostly on paper, a tax shelter that generated impressive deductions but minimal income. They'd been living on credit for years, maintaining appearances through strategic debt management and periodic infusions of cash from sources they couldn't report to the IRS. Sources like rental income from a property they didn't legally own. The beauty of it was almost artistic. They'd created a lifestyle they couldn't afford by stealing from the woman they'd just abandoned in the wilderness. They'd built their entire financial foundation on money that was legally mine, then discarded me when I became inconvenient. I spent 3 days researching, documenting, preparing. I learned about adverse possession laws and rental income tax obligations. I discovered that Jennifer's business had been claiming deductions for a photography studio that didn't exist and equipment that had never been purchased. I found evidence of Freddie's side consulting work that he'd failed to report as income. By the end of the week, I had enough information to destroy them both. Legally, financially, socially. The kind of destruction that would leave them exactly where they'd tried to leave me, with nothing. The old Sienna would have hesitated. Would have worried about going too far. About irreparably damaging relationships that could still be salvaged. Would have found some way to justify their behavior and minimize her own pain. But the old Sienna was dead. She died in that cabin in the woods, murdered by the realization that love without reciprocity isn't love at all. It's exploitation. The woman who sat in that hotel room, surrounded by evidence of her children's betrayal, was someone entirely new. Someone who understood that mercy was a luxury she could no longer afford. Someone who was about to teach her ungrateful children the true cost of abandoning the woman who'd given them everything. I started with Sharon because she was easier, softer, the kind of person who crumbled under pressure rather than fighting back. The certified letter arrived at her Seattle apartment on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who waited to confirm receipt. Inside was a notice of revoked power of attorney, a demand for immediate return of any funds accessed without authorization, and documentation of her legal obligation to account for every penny she'd touched in my accounts over the past 3 years. $23,000. That's what she'd quietly siphoned from my savings during my months of unemployment, thinking I was too broken to notice. Small amounts, carefully spaced to avoid detection, but meticulously documented by banking software that recorded every transaction. She called that afternoon, sobbing into the phone like the child she'd never stopped being. "Mom, I can explain. The money, it wasn't stealing. You always said we were family, that what was yours was ours. I was going to pay it back, I swear. I let her cry for exactly 30 seconds before cutting her off. You will return every dollar within 72 hours, or I will file criminal charges for elder financial abuse. The documentation has already been prepared and reviewed by an attorney. Mom, please. You don't understand. Melissa and we put that money into a down payment. We can't just... You can refinance. You can take out a loan. You can sell whatever you need to sell. What you cannot do is keep money you stole from your homeless mother. The silence that followed was different from the silences I'd endured during my months of begging for help. This was the silence of someone realizing that the rules had changed, that the woman they'd discarded was no longer playing by their playbook. If you pursue this, you'll destroy my relationship with Melissa. Her family will never accept me if they find out I'm a thief. Then you shouldn't have been a thief. She hung up, but not before I heard her start to hyperventilate. Within 6 hours, my account showed a wire transfer for the full amount, plus interest. Melissa's family money, no doubt. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sharon had borrowed from her girlfriend's family to pay back what she'd stolen from her own mother. Freddie required a more comprehensive approach. I began with the house on Oak Street, my mother's property that he'd been illegally collecting rent from for 9 years. The current tenants, a young couple with a baby, were shocked to learn that their landlord didn't actually own the building where they'd been faithfully paying rent for 2 years. We've been sending checks to Freddie Jones for months, the woman told me, bouncing her infant son while her husband looked through their rental agreement. He said he inherited the property from his grandmother. He lied, I said simply. I inherited it from my mother. He's been collecting your rent money without legal authority. What followed was a conversation that left the tenants furious and me with documented proof of Freddie's fraud. They agreed to cooperate fully with any legal proceedings, especially after I assured them their lease would be honored under my ownership. The rental income Freddie had stolen totaled more than $60,000 over 9 years. Money that could have prevented my homelessness, my desperation, my exile in the woods. Money he'd used to fund his family's lifestyle while watching me lose everything. But the financial theft was just the beginning. Jennifer's photography business existed primarily as a tax fraud scheme. The studio, she claimed, didn't exist. The equipment she'd depreciated had never been purchased. The business trips she'd deducted were actually family vacations. 3 years of fraudulent tax returns, each one a federal crime. Freddie's consulting work was equally problematic. He'd been operating as an unlicensed contractor, taking payment in cash to avoid income reporting, while simultaneously claiming his family qualified for low-income housing assistance and subsidized health care. I compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier: bank records, tax documents, rental agreements, witness statements, photographic evidence. Then I made copies. Lots of copies. The first copy went to the IRS, along with a detailed letter explaining the tax fraud I'd uncovered. The second went to the state tax authority. The third went to the local housing authority that had been subsidizing Freddie's family based on falsified income statements. But those were just the legal consequences. The real artistry lay in the social destruction. I created a simple website. Nothing fancy, just clean text and scanned documents. The domain name was freddiechentruth.com, and it told the complete story of my exile and their betrayal. Every lie, every manipulation, every dollar stolen, all backed up with documentation that painted a picture of systematic elder abuse and financial fraud. Then I shared it. Carefully, strategically, devastatingly. Jennifer's photography clients received anonymous emails with links to the website, particularly the section documenting her fraudulent business practices. Freddie's professional network, easily mapped through LinkedIn, received similar notifications. Their neighbors, their children's teachers, their social circles, their professional associations, all of them got to learn exactly who Freddie and Jennifer Jones really were behind their carefully constructed facade. The beauty was in the irony. They'd tried to erase me, to make me disappear into the wilderness where I couldn't embarrass them or burden them or complicate their narrative of success. Instead, I'd become the most visible part of their lives, impossible to ignore or explain away. Freddie called on the 4th day, his voice shaking with rage and panic. "What have you done?" Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? I've destroyed lies, I said calmly. I've destroyed theft. I've destroyed the fiction that you're decent people. You've destroyed our lives. Jennifer lost 3 clients today. The kids' school is asking questions. Our neighbors won't make eye contact. You've made us pariahs. Good. The single word seemed to break something in him. He started crying, actually crying, begging me to take down the website, to call off the investigations, to give him a chance to make things right. I'll pay back every penny, he sobbed. We'll sell the house, liquidate everything. I'll get you the money. I don't want your money anymore, Freddie. I want you to understand what it feels like to have your security stripped away by someone you trusted. I want you to experience the fear and helplessness you forced me to live with. Please, Mom. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was stupid and selfish and wrong, but please, don't call me Mom. You forfeited that privilege when you left me to die in the woods. I hung up and turned off the phone. There was nothing left to say. Within 2 weeks, their house was in foreclosure. Jennifer's business collapsed entirely when her remaining clients discovered her fraudulent practices. Freddie was fired from his job after his employer learned about the pending IRS investigation. The children had to change schools after the parents there learned their family's story. They lost everything, just as they'd intended for me to lose everything. The symmetry was perfect. I never returned to the cabin in the woods. Let it stand as a monument to their cruelty, a reminder of what they'd tried to do to the woman who'd given them life. Instead, I moved into my mother's house, my house, and began the work of rebuilding a life based on truth rather than the fiction of family love. I hired a property management company to handle the rental income properly, invested my mother's trust fund wisely, and settled into a quiet existence free from the exhausting performance of unconditional love. Sometimes I drive past Freddie's old neighborhood and see the foreclosure sign still standing in what used to be his front yard. Sometimes I check their social media and see how they're struggling to rebuild their shattered reputations and finances. I feel nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, no lingering love. They are strangers to me now. People I once knew who revealed themselves to be exactly who they'd always been. My children taught me that family is a choice, not an obligation. They chose to abandon me when I needed them most. I chose to ensure they would never have the opportunity to make that choice again. And that, my friends, is why you should never underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose and everything left to remember. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from.